During World War II, inside of the concentration camps, there were many horrific and sadistic crimes which were carried out by members of the SS Guard Force. Some of the most senior members of staff, the commandants, were known for setting the conditions of sites of imprisonment and slaughter. For example, Rudolf Höss, the Auschwitz commandant, even oversaw the first use of gas chambers himself. Inside of a concentration camp in the Netherlands, known as Herzogenbusch, there was a terrifying incident in which a number of female prisoners, dozens of them, were shoved into a tiny prison cell in retribution for a number of women rising up and protesting about one female prisoner's treatment. The Nazis did not stand for this, and because of the amount of women shoved into that tiny bunker, many died overnight, and this became known as the bunker tragedy. This was just one of many crimes of the SS during World War II, and it is not the most well known about. Join us today as we look at the execution of the female prisoners rammed into a concentration camp dungeon. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Herzogenbusch Concentration Camp was found in the Netherlands, in a place called Vught. The camp opened in 1943, and it was part of the terror brought into the Netherlands during the Nazi occupation of the country. Persecuted people inside of the country had previously been sent to transit camps and then on to other sites such as Auschwitz, but as more people were rounded up, the SS built their own concentration camp there. Construction of Herzogenbusch Concentration Camp, as it was known, began in 1942, and it was based on the sites previously in Germany. The first inmates arrived a year later, and they then had to finish the camp's construction themselves, and during this time in operation, there would be roughly 31,000 prisoners who were locked up there. This included political prisoners, Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses, Gypsies, and others who were targeted inside of the Nazi regime, and also a number of criminals and hostages were locked up there. There were at least 749 people who died in Herzogenbusch because of disease, hunger, and the violence of the guard force, and over 300 of these victims were slaughtered on an execution site just outside of the camp by a firing squad. As the Allies advanced during the Second World War following D-Day, the Nazis would evacuate the camp, and female prisoners were then sent on to Ravensbrück, an all-female site closer to Berlin, and the men were then sent on to Sachsenhausen. When the camp was liberated by the Scottish troops of the 7th Black Watch in October 1944, they found around 600 prisoners who had been left alive, and they had just got there in the nick of time, as the prisoners were to be executed that afternoon. There were also around 500 prisoners whose dead bodies were discovered, their corpses being piled up near to the gate, and these had been shot on the morning of the camp's liberation. As the British troops liberated the site, some of the women told of one of the crimes of the camp, which took place in January 1944, a while ago. This particular atrocity and crime became known as the bunker tragedy, and it took place specifically inside of Herzogenbusch. At the time, the man in charge of the camp was Commandant Adam Grunwald, a man who would later be found guilty by the SS of using excessive force and being too cruel in his role in the camp's running, and in particular, he was removed from his position as commandant because of what happened inside of that bunker in his camp. In January 1944, there was a woman from Barrack Block 23B who had been locked up inside one of the camp's prisons known as the bunker. But a number of other female prisoners were not happy with the treatment she was receiving, and they protested and complained greatly to the other SS guards. However, one of these guards, Hermann Wicklein, encouraged the commandant Adam Grunwald to punish the women for their protest, and Wicklein suggested that the women should be punished together. What came next was that they were all marched towards the bunker and the prison cell block, and 74 women were all thrown into cell 115, of which was very small. This was a prison cell which was 9 metres square, and all 74 women were forced in and then locked in, and there was hardly any room to move or breathe. There was hardly any ventilation inside the bunker, and the women were punished and locked in for 14 hours, struggling and gasping for air. The next morning they were released from the cell, and it was found that 10 female prisoners who had been locked in had died due to a lack of oxygen and also due to the crushing conditions of the cell. One prisoner who was locked inside of the bunker claimed, "When the lights went off, a great panic rose amongst the women. It was a strange swelling sound, which sometimes would diminish but soon swell up again. It was caused by praying, screaming and yelling women. Some tried to yell over it to calm the women down so they could save oxygen. Sometimes it would help a bit, but then it would start again. It would not stop. It continued the whole night. It diminished though, because the heat was suffocating." This incident then became known about, and even before the camp was liberated, there were resistance newspapers in the Netherlands documenting the bunker tragedy as it was known. The Nazi overlords and occupiers were furious that the information had gotten out, and Commandant Grunwald and the senior guard Wicklein were then brought to a court-martial by the SS. As mentioned, Grunwald was considered to have been excessively cruel, and it was said of him that the disciplinary measures led to the health damage that exceeded the legalised scope. A detention of a big number of prisoners in one cell, with extraction of possibility to seat and sleep, might be seen as a measure that is necessary under certain circumstances. However, if the punished prisoner is not physically able to do the punishment without suffering a significant health damage, then it exceeds the permitted measure. For this, Grunwald was found guilty of 10 counts of manslaughter and was sentenced to 3.5 years in prison, and Wicklein was given 6 months imprisonment. He was spared a harsher sentence, as it was said that he didn't wish for the death of the women. However, disgustingly, Adam Grunwald would serve a month inside of a Nazi jail, and he was then released to go and fight on the Eastern Front as a common soldier, as he was stripped of his rank. Grunwald died in the siege of Budapest during the German counter-offensive. Later, after the end of the Second World War, a number of women who had been forced into the cell testified against some of the guards who worked inside of the camp at a war crimes trial. But the bunker tragedy was one of thousands of atrocities which were committed by the SS and the Nazis inside of the concentration camps. The tiny and small cell, which was roughly 9 meters square and had hardly any ventilation, was the place where 10 female prisoners died and succumbed because of the disturbing conditions that they were forced in by the SS guards. The bunker tragedy was terrible, and the panic which was inflicted amongst the prisoners, and the commandant may not have initially intended to kill the women, but he was incredibly foolish, as he would have known that forcing a huge amount of people into a small space with hardly any ventilation would cause suffering and death. Today, Herzogenbusch Concentration Camp is an educational memorial, and still parts of the camp do exist, and the former SS barracks actually is still used by the Dutch military, but the prison where the bunker tragedy took place still does stand. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.